Alright, let's paint the Batman. But let's do it 1:1 scale. I found this awesome model on Printables and Cults 3D. You'll find the link in the description. The model itself is a bit smaller, but I scaled it up about 1 million times in the slicer and cut it into pieces to fit my Bambu P1S, and this is what I ended up with. Life size. Before gluing the pieces together, I gave them a light sanding to give everything some teeth, and I used this foot sander for it, which is recommended by MMsPropShopor, and it's an absolute game changer. I glued the first big parts together and then hid the seam lines with a mixture of UV resin and odorless talcum powder. You want it odorless unless you love that fresh bat baby smell. Anyway, this mixture sands super easy, and if you're safe, it's really a breeze to work with. What wasn't a breeze to work with was with my small table with this giant print, so I moved everything to a bigger setup. Now, scaling a print up a gazillion times is gonna leave some imperfections, so after a little cleanup with a Dremel, I whipped out the UV resin again to start smoothing the print. I'm working in small patches, curing each patch as I go, and while the suit gets a talcum powdered resin coating, I'm using just plain resin on the skin to keep as much of the skin detail as possible. A quick sanding with some 240 grit sandpaper, and not kidding, the model is ready for a first coat of filler primer. After that, all it took was some mild sanding and the model was super smooth. Maybe a little too smooth. So I tore up a makeup sponge and stippled some Mod Podge all over the cowl, giving it that nice rubbery, bubbly texture. A final touch-up with the Dremel to bring back Michael Keaton's iconic lip lines, and the model was ready for priming. I'm not kidding, this took half a day tops, it's so fast this way. One last thing to do was to draw in the irises and pupils, and then Dremel out a flat disc. This will make the eyes look a lot more realistic, because we're gonna put a resin lens over them later. Now, to paint realistic skin, it's important to understand first how skin works. Skin consists of multiple layers that lie over muscle and fat and are infused with tiny blood vessels, hair follicles and glands. And what we see from the outside is basically just light blending all these different colored layers. So for a base coat, I used this Base Flesh by AK Interactive. This color has that nice, warm, muscular undertone. Next was some Amethyst Blue, which is not a skin color, but it will provide some nice, subtle depth in the shadowy areas. I followed up with a thin coat of Flat Flesh by Vallejo and some AK Radiant Flesh, which I only applied on the thicker layers of the face, because the further away the skin is from the bone, the more blush. With the base coat done, I saved my work by applying a coat of matte varnish. I then added some blemishes by speckling them in with the airbrush. The easiest way for me to do this is by first holding down the trigger on the airbrush without pulling it back and letting the airbrush fill with paint. After that, you release the trigger, pull it all the way back, and the paint will just fly out as little droplets. And because I varnished the undercoats, I could easily wipe off any excess blemishes without ruining the paint job underneath. I repeated the stippling, but this time with some diluted white to break up the skin a bit, and clear coated everything for the next step. I'm creating these small capillary veins by first coating the whole face in a red wash, stippling off any of the excess and then spritzing it with isopropyl alcohol. This breaks the surface tension of the paint and leaves you with these very small spider veins. But since any red wash will always leave your skin a little more red than it should be, it's also a good time to block in your lips. I'm using a mix of Radiant Flesh with a little red. You can then slowly blend them back in by sponging them with your top light skin tones. To tone down the red, I added this blue wash, and once I sponged away the excess, I was left with these really cool blue veiny details. Now, of course, all these things are subdermal, but this completes the second part of our skin, the veins and underlying textures. So the next step is to bring back some warmth and light to the skin to make it look more healthy, which you do with really thin layers of paint, like 1 part paint to 20 parts water at low PSI. At this point, I'm also spending a lot of time on the lips with very thin coats of light flesh and mahogany brown, trying to get those highlights and shadows and texture differences just right. To get a skin lightness that I really liked, I used buff, a tiny bit of white and a microdose of light blue, and I misted that in a very low PSI until I got it right. It took about 8 passes. At this point, I blocked in the cowl again to have a better view of the contrast, and I misted a little bit of blush on the upper cheeks with some light flesh and a micro drop of red. Then I started on the 5 o'clock shadow by misting very thin coats of light diluted grey, which I then broke up by sponging a little bit of thinner on them. The stubble itself was created with some blue and black pigments. I loaded up a dry brush, then shook most of it off and applied it in multiple very light passes. A little really goes a long way in this. And once I clear coated that, I used my tiniest brush to hand paint in any small details, blemishes, capillary veins, shaving accidents and whatever. And I could still clean them up with a toothpick. Moving on to the eyes, I first blocked in the eyeballs with some off-white I made with white, a tiny bit of neutral grey, a micro dot of blue and some buff. I'm using smoke black for the eye makeup to have it contrast with the cowl, and I'm also making sure to leave the underline of the eyes unpainted. And with a very diluted mix of buff, white and a micro dot of red, I could glaze in all the insides of the eyes, the tear ducts, and make everything look very fleshy and wet. I redrew the eye shapes and then started slowly building up the iris color, starting with a mix of azure and ultramarine blue. My dumb head will now reveal that I just blocked in the irises. And gone. I first used ultramarine blue to paint in the darkest lines of the irises as well as the iris contour. I made sure to stipple that contour inwards so you have a little bit more of an organic eye shape. The next iris lines I drew were ultramarine blue. Out of focus, I toned down any contrast with some darker lines, and I also added color variation. So for example, the iris of Michael Keaton is not completely blue from the inside, so I added some light yellow streaks to make it have more of a greenish ochre look. Next it was time for a little surgery, adding some little veins to the eyes. For that I used these fibers of a bright red woolen sweater, which I held in place with some very diluted Mod Podge and isopropyl alcohol. It's important to not overdo the veins in the eyes, so a little goes a long way, and when I was finished I covered everything with another very thin coat of watered down Mod Podge and isopropyl alcohol. Before adding the UV resin, I sealed the eyes once more with a satin varnish. And I also added this clear coat to the lower lip to give it a little wetness. To create the cornea, I carefully put UV resin only on top of the iris, building it up to be a nice little dome shape. And after that dome was built up, I could put a tiny layer of UV resin over the rest of the eye for the glossiness. Once that had cured, I could tone down the eye white just a little bit with some satin varnish, and I was ready to paint the rest of the bat suit. This video is not something you're used to getting from the OWA. I know usually I do more outworlds. It did feel like a project that I needed to do. One reason because Michael Keaton was my first Batman, especially Michael Keaton in 1992. That was the first Batman movie I ever watched. But I also just needed to do this project for myself to see if I can do it, if I can tackle this challenge. My next project will probably bring me back to the Roninbot universe. I've had a lot of requests building a second one and I am fully ready to go. If you haven't learned about the Roninbot universe, you can click the video showing here. And otherwise, stick around for the glamour shots, and I thank you so much again for watching this video.